I think so too.
Herding cats. And this is what, like 5 of us. Just imagine if we had,
Yeah, 12 or 14.
yeah.
I'm ready to move forward.
Being interactive.
Deer, she's otherwise occupied.
That's the good thing about the table, we can push on the table.
It's not a big thing.
Where those, where they don't have arms, they're hard to get in and out of.
I need you to come here for a
Oh, you
minute,
need me to come here?
please.
Okay. Well, just let me get my,
You know where is she gonna stand up there?
okay?
She might stand here by the computer, advanced slides, that's probably what I'll do too, but I'm gonna stand here to begin
That's
with.
great.
Okay, y'all get ready there.
They're not
1900 or something? Last one, there.
inactive at their school. If you
Oh,
still.
it's not?
Well, it's.
You're right in the sun, sit on the other side, that's,
Thank you for the.
It'll go away.
yes, too soon.
You're not better that way. I'll sit over here when I sit, because that would be.
You're not gonna sit for a minute.
Yeah, hopefully.
Deb,
You wanna sit
Deb.
over here?
you're not gonna sit for a minute. I
We're not
need you
gonna
to,
sit?
you're not gonna sit for a minute.
Okay.
Till I'm-
You know, I can sit
Till
down.
I'm done with
Okay,
my
till you're
part.
done with your song?
Well, I'm gonna talk for a minute too. So
Okay,
this works by pushing this button and then it records.
okay.
So I'm gonna stand up there and sing.
All right,
and then I'm gonna stand
this
over-
button?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Are you gonna tell me turn it off when it's time to turn it off?
And I'm done, we'll turn it off and I'll come over here and I'll take Mary Louise.
Okay. I think I got it. I'm not the tech person.
You can aim it if you want this way
I did aim it.
and you can close up and stuff that way.
Oh, now he's getting complicated on me here.
You,
A celebration. Okay.
So you've been doing all right?
Yeah, and no money.
Good, good.
We miss you at book club though.
I know. It's an interesting.
I got it.
We're able to get out of it. It's old enough to have those very cool.
We'll just do it, we can do it.
That's why I don't like you.
Yeah.
And stuff too.
Is there a fine tuning?
fine
You know,
tuning.
whatever your
I
kids.
see the kids are going, I have to.
I have it nice and close up
Yeah.
to say a celebration, but it doesn't,
We just got Deb and us and
recognizing 200 years is not
girls, Galen.
real
Don't
long.
worry about that.
We all
Okay.
got together in Indiana last.
Okay, go for it, dear.
Alright,
Yeah.
hey Mark, can I?
We're a small group, but we're
Mr.
here.
Young, Mark, could we get, could you have a seat? I want to start.
Sit.
We're about ready to start,
Yeah,
finally.
we'd like to start.
I told Mim she's coming later, but
I told
Yeah.
Mary Louise, I'm excited to have Mary Louise here, and she brought Albert, and they're from the
so
district
excited
club,
you guys
yeah.
are here.
And so I think we're gonna have a lot of educational stuff thrown at you. So I'm the comedic relief. So I wrote a song that's more about the village than it is about the church. We're going to get into the church and all that. So this is just a little song because I like doing this. I don't know what's better to see, but this was Johnny Cash's big song. So it sounds like a train, doesn't it? I hear the train coming down the tracks. I hear the whistle singing, let it take you back to a time was life and slower, and your neighbor was your friend. When you went to church on Sunday and greeted the preacher with a grin. Can't do that, Johnny Bass. You know that track was laid back in 1852 from Cleveland to PA by a mighty crew. Well, they honed their skills and cleared the way so the world would come by here. And that depot sure got busy. Even Lincoln rode by here. Well, the trains, they kept on coming clear across the land, 'cause of that golden spike in which our Henry lent us a hand. Well, the times they are a-changin', they were a-changin', from sea to shining sea. And Nottingham was on the map for all the world to see. Well, railroads made this country what it is today, moving people and cargo all along the way. And those tracks, they multiplied, and trains run faster all the time. And we syncopate our watches so our schedules work out fine. No matter which side of those tracks you may stay, we all owe a debt to those who cleared the way. Well, those tracks, they keep on moving everything we need. So when you cross those tracks, say a prayer and lift your feet. Well, I hear the train a-comin', coming down the tracks. I hear the whistle singing, let it take you back to a time when life was slower and your neighbor was your friend. When you went to church on Sunday and greeted the preacher with a grin. All aboard. Okay.
Amen.
So just to get us in the flavor of it, you know, we're all here because of our church relationship, but we're all here because of that train track that's out the door that I just heard the whistle and the going. So it keeps coming. So I'm going to do a quick review of a couple things that a lot of you know about, and then we're going to turn it over to Mary Louise.
Want me to record that, this part?
Yeah, I'm going to do these slides. I don't care.
Okay.
You want to So we're celebrating 200 years, as y'all know, and okay, we're going to wake up. So we started with a camp meeting in 1821. That's why we're celebrating 200 years here. And that camp meeting, there were no pictures back in 1821, so we do have some drawings and stuff, and they were a big deal, you know. In 1821, there wasn't much out here, so, and I think you're going to talk a lot about some of that.
It's funny because I use the same graphic.
And here's a picture of this area with all the Indian trails that followed the creeks and followed the receding lake ridges from Lake Erie or whatever it was before it was Lake Erie. So, so that kind of paved the way. And you can't see this, but it's a picture of up on the ridge, because that's where the camp meeting took place. So after the camp meeting, you know, we don't know how many people were there, but we know after the camp meeting, well, what are we doing here? Guess we got to hit the right key. The people that got excited and wanted to pursue keeping together were these initial class members. So these are names. The only one that you probably know is Dennis Cooper, because there's been a picture over here since you guys were kids here. It shows a picture of a house, and I'll show you that picture. But these are other people. There were about 10, 12 people. What's really interesting is this was written by a guy named Reverend Samuel Gregg in 1865. He was a pastor in this church in the 1870s. So it's a small world, you know. But he wrote this initial history of within the bounds of the Erie Conference of the Methodist Church. So that's Reverend Greg. But these people, if you go to any of these cemeteries and walk around, you'll see some of these names. If you go to the East Cleveland Cemetery, you'll see some of these names. But Dennis Cooper, I'll talk a little bit about Rule House. He was in partnership with William Tree and in the shipbuilding thing that was at the mouth of the creek. They ended up moving into East Cleveland, and he's buried in another cemetery. Betsy and Hannah Bishop were daughters of Abraham Bishop. There's Bishop Road out there. They were out there in what was, they sold their property to the Peltons when the Peltons came in 1816. And so, but it's sad, we have no recollection from these folks because I think they passed away pretty young. So John E. Aiken, he actually became a Methodist pastor, and so that's kind of cool. He was inspired by this. Father Woodward and his wife, you probably came, those of you in Cleveland Heights come down the hill, you pass Woodward Avenue. So I'm assuming Woodward's lived somewhere over in that direction. And it says father, but if you see these original documents, penmanship wasn't and spelling were optional in those days. So the guy's name was really Luther. So if you see this, this was really Luther Woodward. Now I can't explain Father Murray because it's not Luther Murray. There's an Enoch and an Eli Murray. So, but anyway. And then Richard Curtis, another Methodist, and ended up moving out to Manaway. So anyway, this was the group that started, and we owe them our beginnings. And I should hit that button. So this is the Cooper home. The picture's still over there. And this is the obelisk that's up in the cemetery. And this is the insignia that none of you can see, but it shows that he's dead and buried. Maybe buried there because he predates when the cemetery was formed. So, you know, they move people, yeah. And I'm assuming he was on his own property, which he did live on, it was actually called Cooper Road before it was called Green Road.
Which cemetery is this?
This is the Euclid one, right up
On the hill.
on the hill, yeah. Yeah, so my first time looking for him, I drove in and parked in the middle of the cemetery, and I walked up this way and walked down the hill, and then I walked up this way and walked down the hill, and I couldn't find this thing, and I went to my car, frustrated, and I turned around, and he was staring at me the whole time. So that's how that stuff works.
It works that way in the pantry
But the Coopers were very
too.
fundamental to us. By 1829, our first church building was been at like the corner of Green and Euclid is where it would have been. And on early maps of the township, they show a location for a Methodist meeting house. And our own documentation says that this was the building that was across the street before this building was built. So, so that's documented. Our history indicates that this building was moved from the previous location, which was what was then Euclid Village, where Chardon Road comes down the hill where the Euclid Historical Society is. That used to be the center of Euclid. Their town hall and everything was there. So they moved in the 1850s there from Green Road, just not even a half a mile into the village. And so they stayed there. And it's rumored that maybe they moved this building twice. I wouldn't have moved it twice. Good. So I have trouble believing that. But anyway, so that's that building. And you know about the next building, I believe.
Let's are we here now?
Well, you're going to talk about the Croziers quite a bit, I think.
A little bit, but no, go ahead.
But this ties in Margaret here. So
Uncle Jimmy's wife, what was it called?
they came here in 1816. Amanda was 6 or 7 years old, and her parents were charter members of the church. whenever it got incorporated. Now, I don't have that exact date, but it was between 1821 and 1828, because in 1828, there's documentation that we built a building and the church was located there. So that's pretty cool. But if you read any of these newspaper accounts from the Nottingham Citizen and stuff, there's always stuff about the Frizzels on the lake and stuff. So they owned property on the lake, and it was a summer resort and that kind of a thing. So and everyone, a lot of the people were farmers and grape growers and that kind of a thing. So we'll hear a little bit more about them, but they both came from Massachusetts, right? And they knew each other in Massachusetts before they came here. So, but I doubt she was betrothed when she was 7 when she came. But anyway, but I believe they came together because of their families.
And
So
how did Margaret?
Oh, yeah. Thank you, dear. I know I keep you around for. So you can't see this, but this is is it Uncle Jimmy, your James Cameron?
Big pardon?
James Cameron, was he your uncle or?
Uncle.
Yeah, this is his grave
Yeah.
thing. You can't see it very clear. And Margaret, this is your wedding picture.
Yeah.
1949.
No,
So, but this is her uncle, and then this is your daughter's
Yeah.
wedding here at the church. And this is at the church too.
Yeah.
So I just thought it was so cool. We have these crochets that go back to 1816 here. And Margaret is still here. And it's just, I think that's cool. That's awesome. And James, you want to say anything about James? Because I know he was kind of instrumental in the church. He's on all the trustee stuff.
What I remember most, it was Easter Sunday, and the minister asked him to say the congregational prayer, and nobody understood a word he said. Because his throat was so thick.
Yes. And he was from Scotland, right?
Yeah, oh yeah.
Yeah. So this is one of those families that came from Scotland.
Yeah.
Yeah, and married into these Croziers that were here from the beginning. So married an Addie Crozier. So that's just exciting to me. So just real fast, this is a map of Euclid. This is an 1852 map. But just so you can see this is Cooper's property. This would have been Green Road, Cooper Road it was called then. And this is Euclid Avenue. And this is the village of Euclid. At this time, this would have been called, probably, it would have been called nothing up here where Nottingham is. By 1858, because 1852 is when the railroad came in. And so the depot came there, and so then it became the center of what was going on in those days. And this location was originally called Euclid Depot, and then in 1865 it became Nottingham. But this is the house property, this is the tree property. So those other guys, I don't know where they are, but because 1852 is quite a bit after 1821, and most of the ones that moved on had already moved on. But these are the locations of where our church was. So here it is near the corner on the north side of Euclid by Green Road. Here it is in Euclid Village. This is like Shard Road coming down. And this is the little square that has the Historical Society now, and there was a town hall and stuff there. But that's where we were in the 1850s. 1867, we moved up here, across the street, in that shack of a church. It could have been nice when it was all painted and fresh, but it's funny that then here we are now. So you get some reference, but what's cool and I think relevant to us is that we were always in this like half mile to a mile diameter. We served this community, this neighborhood from the beginning. It was called Euclid then, then it was called Nottingham, but it's still, now it's Cleveland, and often called Collinwood. But it's Nottingham.
Still Nottingham.
Yes,
I like
it
that,
is.
Mary Louise.
And so here it just shows you the map where it was in Euclid Village on that corner. The Euclid Hotel and the town hall are there. This is the school that became the Historical Society. So just to give you some roots from where we were. Do that quickly. This is an 1874 map that shows that we are here, and this is the same shape of the church picture that you see, because it had this, I don't know, portico. Roy would tell us the exact name of it, and a bell tower above it here. So there we are, and then we ended up over here, but not till 1892. So there we are. So maps are fun. You guys are talking about the building here, but this was the original building, and the doorway went down that way out to the
So
street.
you would have come in under the steeple.
Yeah, right under the steeple, right here. And this here explains the triangle we were talking about right here.
I was gonna say, yeah.
Yeah, because there was a stained glass window here that went out. So, yeah. So that's, and these gas lights are not cool too. So that was taken after 1892 and before 1921. So I got one more song, and then I'm going to let Mary Louise talk. So this one, maybe you can sing along on the chorus, Deb, if you want to advance the slides.
Okay.
And use the forward arrow key. On the bottom. Do you know what I mean? On the bottom?
Yes.
To the right, okay.
Thank you. Down. I'm glad you said down, because there's right, left, up, and down.
I used the right arrow, I'm sorry.
Okay.
And this song, you guys know that song? Okay. It's the Battle of New Orleans. So we're going to do it slow so you can join me in singing along. In 1820, or was it 21, a circuit rider came this way, the awakening had begun. They gathered up on the ridge, folks came from miles around. Their preacher was inspiring, his message was profound. Well, the preacher kept preaching and the people kept a-coming. Kept on coming and the camp was filled with love. They sang so loud and their voices just got stronger. The sound rang out and was heard for miles around. Good. Methodist classes Warren Cooper led the way. Its faithful members promised to live their faith lives by faith. They raised the church not far from here in 1829. Professor Prosser preached the words, folks really walked the line. Johnny Cash reference. Well, the preacher kept preaching and the people kept a-coming. They kept on coming and the church was filled with love. They sang so loud and their voices just got stronger. The sound rang out and was heard for miles around. The church in Euclid grew and grew and moved a couple times. Always in this neighborhood, new villages defined. Nottingham was up and coming, the railroad made it so. New jobs and homes and plenty sure helped the village grow. This is where it does the fast thing. Well, it grew so fast, the people kept on coming. And next by Cleveland, our neighborhood remains. Through thick and thin, the church kept on going. 200 years of serving, the spirit is still aflame. Good job. Nottingham's proud to be Christ Hansen's peace right here. Our numbers have declined, but the spirit goes up here. Many saints of God before following your way. We'll serve our Lord and neighbor as your spirit leads the way. Well, the preacher kept preaching and the people keep a-coming. They'll keep on coming as the church is filled with love. We'll sing so loud and our voices will get stronger. The song's running out to be heard from miles around. We'll do that the fast way. Yeah, oh, the preachers will keep preaching and the people keep a-coming. They'll keep on coming as the church is filled with love. We'll sing so loud and our voices will get stronger. The sound will ring out and be heard for miles around.
Two, three, four.
Well done. Well done. So we're going to introduce Mary Louise.
Oh, and I just followed that.
Yeah, that's all right. Now you can.
This is the end of the slide.
Oh, yeah, I know.
That's what I was thinking. You've got one too, right?
Yes.
Maybe the sun will go down because you can see it better already now than you
Yeah.
did. So
Yeah.
Having moved it over to the other round.
that sun has the it's no jigger huh?
From this direction.
Do you wanna be here, or do you wanna advance around the slides, or you want me to play?
Let me just be right here, that way I'll only be, you can look, because you can see from this way, and excuse my back. She can, excuse my back. First of all, I just wanted to thank Pastor Debbie and Gib for inviting us to be here, meet to be here tonight to try to put some history together for the community and the like. Just a little bit of background. My name is Mary Louise Jessic Daly. I'm a Collinwood girl. I grew up in the Collinwood Inn in the Nottingham area. I've lived in the area for over 50 years. My parents had moved here. My mom had moved here, actually from Kansas coal fields, back in the 40s. And so we have a lot of background, a lot of roots in the Collinwood and Nottingham areas. But some years back, Gib put together the Nottingham Historical Society. And we were involved with that. And then it was coming up on the anniversary of the Collinwood School Fire, the 100th anniversary of the Collinwood School Fire back in 2008. And we decided to get together and put a program together to do that centennial commemoration. And then, because we were having so much fun, we decided to stay together. And that's when I talked to Gib and said, you know what, let's combine the two groups. Let me use the Nottingham name as well. And we became the Collinwood and Nottingham Historical Society. Unfortunately, through the years, even though we've been around, we're out there teaching, talking, and doing what we had set out as our mission to do. We've never really truly become a 501c3, and we don't really have a physical place. And that's kind of hampered a number of things, but we're still out there talking. Gib still does a lot of his history, as you just saw, and now we decided that, after the pandemic, or actually this was before the pandemic, we decided to get back and pull a number of people back together. So now he says, to make ourselves seem a little bit more, anchored, and to make sure that history is shared and is out there, we've put these two back on our board, and, so that we can try and move forward a little bit more with it. And we've got a number of other ex officio officers, like the Cleveland Restoration Society, because we've been working with them on other projects, just not totally official. I wear two hats, kind of sort of in the community. I wear a hat as president and chair of the historical group, but I'm also Councilman Plessig's administrative assistant. So I work, in the community a lot of times, a lot of that bounces
community
back and
shield's
forth.
going to be there.
Exactly. So this is just a little bit about me. I don't know if you can see, but I always tell people, tell people, I can introduce myself. Not that I like to talk about just myself a lot, but if you see something up here that you have a question about, ask me afterwards. But one other thing is, my husband and he encouraged me to do some of my own talks. He had done some talks before. We've been married 19 years now, and he just retired on Memorial Day as the executive director for the Soldiers and Sailors Monument downtown. So since about 2002, we've had free reign at the monument. So a lot of my history, I've been able to do a lot of researching and pull that Civil War history into the community and the like. So it's the historical group's main function is to teach about the Collinwood School Fire and to keep those names alive. And we have done some serious research over the years, and it culminated in someone else actually doing a book, not us, but that book is out there. It's a newer book. It just came out actually
Just before the pandemic.
2 weeks before the pandemic hit, so we never were able to do book you know, all the fun stuff with the book, and we really need to talk to him and see if we can now get back out there with the book. But the memorial in the back of the book is all our work. It's the best list of names that you're going to find at any time, and there's still issues with it. We're still looking for our children. Then we talk about Oliver Hazard Perry. I'm the only one who can put Oliver Hazard Perry into any talk that I do. But he was very important for a history within this community, but Colwyn, Nottingham area, because we all share Hoover Beach area and the lake. And the Battle of Lake Erie was a part of our history here just as much as it is a part of Cleveland's history. And then we always talk, of course, about our veterans, because you'll see, as one of my slides says, war was a catalyst for a lot of growth and development within this community. And when I talk, what I've come, always forget is I really need to put a lot more of the Nottingham history, into it, but it parallels a lot. So if you see something that I say only Collinwood, it does parallel. There's a lot of that same growth and development that occurs across this entire area, and it's all because of that railroad. So that first one that you sang was great. We just went to, as an aside, we just went to Wilmington. We were down in South Carolina, and we had gone to Wilmington, North Carolina for the day. Totally forgot that they had a railroad museum. Walked onto their site and found it by pure accident because we were looking for something else. Cool. We just it happens to be next to their so-called visitor center, and they have a caboose sitting there. But then on the tracks that come off there and go to the lake there, the waterfront there, they have an engine, a tender, and then a boxcar. It's the only museum that I have ever seen that ever talks about the hobo trade and hobos jumping the railroad and then the boxcars. So I was like, my grandfather was one. So it's, it was really interesting to see that. Just as one other little advertisement, then I'll get to my talk. We all know Colwyn. How many are familiar or had gone to Colwyn High School?
Familiar.
In Colwyn High School, you have those beautiful murals that over the years were damaged and cut up and stuff like that. They have now been digitized.
Oh.
So they are in the process. They digitized them. They're in the process of being able to do to complete the murals where they're broken or torn or missing pieces because of a doorway that was cut into the mural. How many of you remember the 999? The train that used to come through the neighborhood as a part of their parades. It's a third scale of the original. There is a 999 train that was a speed record speed. That 999 train is back up and running thanks to the Painesville Train Museum.
Cool.
And next week it will be in the Painesville Parade. Not next week, the week after. It will be in the Painesville Parade. With that, the Painesville Train Museum, which we are going to be connected with, as a collaboration piece, they're adding onto their depot a piece of their museum, and it's built specifically so that they can have a community center and a banquet hall. But more so, it will house the 999 train. And because, let's say the train sits here, the wall behind that train will talk about Nottingham and Colwyn history. It will give a timeline, and what is going to be used is that mural. And then those murals, and because it talks about the history of the trains in this area from 1848 to the Industrial Revolution type period, with the 1960s and 70s, when the trains were still very, very important, and they still are because we still hear them all the time.
Oh, yeah.
So with that, I'm going to try doing this without, and again, I'm with the historical group today. And here we're going to be talking about Amanda, but more so because part of what we do with the historical group is settlement history. And I always say that if I don't learn something new every day, every time I do a talk, then I'm not doing my job. So that's your job, and partly it's already been taken care of, so it's off of you guys tonight. I've already learned a couple of new things. Again, Amanda Frazier-Fazell, and I love it. That's one of the reasons why you'll see my double last name, because it's a format of history. And I love it when people use their full names, because then you can tell the woman, you know, her maiden name, and her married or second married, and you can understand her history better.
Yes.
Amanda was born in Peru, Massachusetts in 1809. And then she has the daughter of Jason, and her name is Irma Minerva Newton.
Wow.
Mouthful, yes. You can't really see this a whole lot, and this just tells a little bit about Peru. And Peru wasn't its first name. It's in the Berkshires. So it's a beautiful part of Massachusetts. It's in the Berkshires, and it was actually named something else, and I think it's like Parkersburg or something close to Parker's Field, I think, something like that. And there was name changed. Well, it didn't actually change its name until 1809. So when any of the books or papers say that she was born in Peru, Massachusetts, you really need, if you're going to ever do any research, you're going to have to look at the original name of the city, because you won't find her under Peru, because again, it didn't change its name until 1809.
Partridgefield.
Yes. I'm sorry, Partridgefield. So, and this, even though this map is from much later, I just wanted to use that for the Nottingham part of it. And they did come here in 1816 at age 7. Well, like everybody that I ever talked to, I do a lot of talks, and they're varied talks. One's on Alvarez and Perry, another one's on Moses Cleveland. And I always tell people, think of the person, and think of that dash in between the birth and death date. Because if you look at Moses Cleveland and you look at his birth date and his death date, and they're both, he was born and died in Canterbury, Connecticut. Seems like a very boring person, doesn't he? Well, we all know that in between there, at some point in time, he was a general in the American Revolution and made it here as part of the Western Reserve Land, Land Company, and the Connecticut Land Company, and founded, our area. So always look at that dash in between. Western lands, before 1809, we were part of those Western lands after the American Revolution. And it was the whole idea that it was our job to move in that Western expansion. Actually, this is kind of an interesting quote. It says, as early as 1754, the inhabitants made a bona fide purchase of the natives of a large tract of land extending from the River Delaware westward about 170 miles, including the whole breadth of the 42nd degree of the north latitude, and fairly included in the royal grant to the Plymouth Company in the year of our Lord 1620. So when the Pilgrims came in 1620, and remember, there's a whole lot of settlement far prior to 1620 in America. They were not the first. And then you take that 42nd parallel and you go all the way across. That technically was the property that was granted to Connecticut. Well, then what they really only took out of that, though, is from the Ohio state line east to west. But then after they gave up the Firelands area, so we then only went up to Sandusky. So literally the four corners today of the Western Reserve are Conneaut to Youngstown, Sandusky, and I'm going to remember this marker this time, Milan, Ohio. And again, that westward expansion was kind of sort of, it was something that we just got granted to us. It was inevitable. That's what we were supposed to do. We were just supposed to, it was inevitable that we just kept moving across and doing that settlement. And we all know the Northwest Ordinance, or Northwest Territory and the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. And in between that first Bill of Rights and 1803, when Ohio becomes a state. So keep those dates in mind. So when Amanda and her family came to this area, Ohio was already a state. So they're actually a little bit late compared to some of the other settlement people who had already been here, like the Dilly family. And I'll talk about the Dilly family in a little bit. Again, the Connecticut Land Company was a syndicate to purchase groups and to come out here. And really and truly, they purchased the land to then come out here and sell off plots. The proceeds were supposed to go to the school district in Canterbury, Connecticut. It was never profitable. And this is why they believe that Moses Cleveland died early or young, was because he took it upon himself to worry about why they never raised enough funds for the sale of these properties. It was supposed to, the proceeds, as I said, was supposed to be earmarked to the Connecticut School Fund. And again, they came out, as an investor company, and I can talk about Moses Cleveland for an hour. So, but again, they were authorized to come out to, and again, I told you about, with the Firelands area, cut off that Firelands area, and they were authorized to come out and sell off pieces of property. They came and settled in the Cleveland area, what we know as Cleveland, and then he went back. July 22nd, 1796 is when they came into the lake. They came from Conneaut, came down part of the lake, and then into where the Cuyahoga River is, connects into the lake area, and then they came up onto the land area in the East Bank of the Flats, because they weren't allowed to be on the West Bank. There was Indians on the West Bank, and they didn't have permission to be over there. That's what started the wars and the battles of crossing the river. And those stories are real and true. So if you do cross the river today, make sure you have a passport. It's still true today. But again, they came in, but then a number of his people that came with him got disgusted with him and said, "You're not giving us enough property, and we're not going to make enough money off of this." So he told them, okay, you can then go 8 miles east to that bluff area that we've seen, and you can go and settle that area. What is that area? Euclid Township. It was cheap. The lure, what it was, is it was the lure of cheap land and fertile fields, wild game, and that drew the New England farmers, because they considered, by this time already, they considered their soils, poor and unproductive, and they wanted different types of soils. We're at the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains. We have what they call glacial till in this area. If you go to Baldy Mountain in the Euclid Creek area, you'll see all the different layers that were formed in this area. And it sits on Baldy Mountain is that glacial till. And if you find the little quartz nodules, that's how you know it's glacial till. And again, he founded Euclid Township in September of that year. And out of that area, we all know today that what's founded out of it. And I want to make sure that I have the right cities here. Euclid, Lyndhurst, South Euclid, Cleveland Heights, Richmond Heights, and then the Collinwood Village area, the Nottingham Village area. And as again, I always tell people, think of our community as you foresee it, and split it in east-west. The line is basically 167th from the lake down to the second set of railroad tracks, and probably beyond there actually to Cedar. But in general, if you think of Nottingham or Collinwood and Nottingham, if you think of it, Collinwood is 131 to 167, Nottingham 167 to 200th today, and beyond that was Euclid Township and the Heights areas. Our founders of the communities areas were people like, they were out of Vermont, Rutledge, Vermont, Washington, PA, which is south of Pittsburgh, Canterbury, Connecticut areas. You had, you know, our named people that we know, the Carters, you had the Dilly families, the Rubel families, and then, of course, your Croziers and Frozels and all those types of founding member families. These you can see those pictures of Jason and Irma, Amanda's parents. And I was really excited as I actually went off on that little rabbit hole, except that I found more information. I actually got excited when I was reading what you had sent to me, Gib, and then when I was doing some other further research, I was actually more excited about her son. And I'll get to her son in a moment. Her son is actually tingles my toes more because there's things about her, like her family and her siblings and her children and her husband, but not like how you can describe her and not just about her. Well, her son, I can give you what he did in his life. So, okay, so 1809. What was going on in 1809? It was a busy year. Whoops.
Jumped on you.
No. 1809. We were both fighting the Napoleonic Wars, where Napoleon was out there fighting. It was after Trafalgar in 1805. We were also in the Peninsula Wars. There was an unknown, this is 1809, there's an unknown lieutenant in Algiers at this time by the name of Oliver Hazard Perry. The USS Constitution is also recommissioned for like the third time, at this time. We have an embargo going on. Had been repealed, and this is what actually gets us more involved into the Peninsula Wars, which are out in Algiers and all the other. But I thought it was interesting that James Madison becomes our president. But what's interesting is always put into perspective who was born and who died in those years, if I can find them. Abe Lincoln was born this year. Charles Darwin, Edgar Allan Poe, Alfred Lord Tennyson, Oliver Wendell Holmes, Kit Carson.
Good.
But who died? Joseph Haydn and Thomas Paine. I actually found when Amanda and her family came here, they came with their grandfather, John Crozier, and there were 17 people in their family that came into this area. So we come from Peru, Massachusetts, which is western Massachusetts, and come overland pretty much till you get to this area. And I'll explain why they would even come into this area in the first place. Why would they even know about it? And they came here on January 1st of 1816. Folks, it's the middle of winter. The ground is frozen. The lake is frozen. Think about that, and they traveled in covered sleighs pulled by oxen, and I was actually able to find a couple of photos. These aren't three-team oxen groups, but at least I found what a covered sleigh looks like from that period. And this is pretty much what those would have looked like. 17 included her grandfather and his third wife. Remember, women died in childbirth very often. So you had his third wife and 2 of her children from her first marriage. Then you had Amanda's parents, and they had a total of 7 children, I do believe. There's 2 that are born after they arrive here, but they're here with 4 of her other siblings. And again, a Luther. That's why when we talk about Luther.
Yeah.
Luther must have been a very popular name at the time. You see it a number of times coming up. And then her half-brother from her father's first wife, again, a number of double marriages and things like that. I know the Rubel family has some strange stuff going on too. They had 2 brothers that married 2 sisters. There were sisters that their husbands died and they married, and so you had
Oh, my.
intermixed children of those marriages. It's weird. I try to follow that genealogically. It's interesting. But again, they also included the grandfather's second son and his wife and 3 children. So it was an extended family that decided to leave Peru for whatever reason, possibly just better opportunities. They were farmers, so just better opportunities further west. Their neighbor was David Dilley. David Dilley's family came in, obviously, much earlier, and again, they were here before 1800s. David Dilley's family would end up owning properties not only in the Nottingham area, but also in the what we refer to as the Collinwood community. And I know that there was a Dilley farm area right at the area of where the freeway is today, at Westrup and Sylvia, right in that area. As a matter of fact, that one farmhouse, that's where the BP station is today. There's a house 2 doors up from that I keep screaming and yelling that we can't tear it down, but I don't know what to do with it. It's vacant. I believe that if it's not that house, it's another house that was built on that property, but in that area. Plus, then there was an old farmhouse, if you remember, there by Riddell's. They had a white fence around it. That was an original farmhouse too. That, I believe, is where a Dilley family lived. In fact, that son, Charles, died at Andersonville in the Civil War. So they had a lot of property in both communities. David had traveled through this area as a part in the American Revolution, and he was part, which I did not know until doing this research, that he was part of Crawford's campaign. You see it on his stone in the cemetery, but when I first looked it up some years ago, I couldn't find hardly anything about it. Now all of a sudden I'm finding all kinds of information about what Crawford's raid or campaign was. And it was with Colonel William Crawford later after the war, against the Native Indians in the Sandusky area. So right away, in our looking back, we can see problems. Can we see problems here?
Yes.
We can almost see the tragedy that's going to happen with this. They had partnered with the British though. See, this was that period in between the American Revolution and the War of 1812, where the Indians have now partnered with the British, and there was always that fear that if the British worked enough with the Indians, that there would be another raid, and they would raid all of these communities up and along the lakefront. And that will come into play in a little bit in the War of 1812. But the campaign was not well organized. Crawford was actually captured, tortured, and burned at the stake. And I actually found a painting that somebody had done with that, and all about 70 were killed because of that raid. But David was able to escape from this defeat and traveled back through this area on retreat and then back home. That's why he knew about this area. And even though with that Indian threat in Sandusky, today, an hour and a half's drive on the freeway, it was still close enough to be a threat even then. He still decided that he still wanted to come back here and settle. And then others, like our Crozier family and the Frizzell family, followed. This is just a little bit more about, he's also related to William Harrison, and that's something that I want to do a little bit more research on. You can't see this, but this is when the execution of Crawford. And again, the Indians and their British allies are at Detroit. And that is significant for when the War of 1812 starts in earnest, and why a battle on Lake Erie was inevitable at some point in time. There's a marker out there, according to it. And again, so at this time, there's this small village called Euclid Township, and a few miles west of here, and later renamed Colliver and then East Cleveland. So, you know, like your map is showing all these different, they were starting to get different names to talk about small areas. And it clicked with me today too. When we had to redistrict this area, and we took Nottingham out of Councilman Plonsik's domain, we made sure that, because Euclid Green, before that, Nottingham was with Collinwood, but Euclid Green was set off from it. So the one good thing that did come out of that redistricting is that we put Euclid Green community back with Nottingham. You know, and I never really thought about it until today. That, you know, that's one good thing that came out of that, is that Euclid Green becomes a part back to Nottingham community. And if the councilman and I have anything to say about redistricting when we have to do it again, coming up because of this last census, to making sure that we can make sure that Euclid Green stays with Nottingham, and then we're trying desperately put Nottingham back with Collinwood so that we can put our history back together. Again, this is just that map in that Euclid Creek area. Matter of fact, we belong to an organization called Northeast Ohio Inter-Museum Council, which is a conglomeration of about 150 different parks, because the Metro Parks is part of it, archives, museums, and the like. We can't be a part of it because we don't have a physical place. But we're going to actually be in the Euclid Creek Reservation on the 20th. That's one of our first time back since March, you know, since the pandemic hit in March of 20. And it's our first time back. We usually meet 4 times a year, so everybody's all excited. It says, well, you're coming back to a really historic area. And we're going to be talking about the train and Roy Larrick is our speaker that night, so it'll be interesting. So we get into the War of 1812, and again, this is frontier, folks. There's nothing, anything. Think about the building of, you know, the Niagara in Erie. Where did they get the timber from? It's all the forest that, you know, starts from about where we are at here and go up the hill. I mean, it's like Erie, PA was the same way. We started from and went right straight up the hills. There was nothing but virgin timber. So this is the frontier. The treaty with Britain ended the recent War of 1812, but that war is a catalyst for this community. There's a number of men who are in this area who either are already here and joined the War of 1812, or after the War of 1812 come to this area. And again, we have in the early Dilly families, we have all these other people. And then the Civil War will be that second catalyst of growth and development, because in between those two wars, we have the railroad that comes in and will spark, you know, the changes of the names in here. Because early on, Collinwood didn't even have a name. It was stop number 10 on the railroad between Conneaut and Painesville. It was the Ashtabula-Painesville, you know, line, Cleveland line, and then, you know, it becomes, you know, the Lakeshore, Michigan Southern, but that's with all the different conglomerations and stuff. But it sparks here, and this is why I keep telling people who complain about the railroad, folks, it was here in 1848. So I don't want to hear it, but as I said, both wars act as catalysts for this area of growth and development, and the changes for the families themselves, because the Ruppel family will lose their one of their sons out of 13 that served, and will die brutally at Stones River. So, and then of course the Dilly boy who dies at Andersonville after serving with Hayes, Rutherford B. Hayes. So and they bring all that history back to us. And again, with the Battle of Lake Erie, Perry's up at Erie. He builds his ships. We've got all this stuff going on in Detroit. The Battle of Lake Erie, as I said, is inevitable. And that's why he's sent to Erie to build ships. So where do you have to sail past? You have to sail past Euclid Beach area and the Euclid Creek area. And inevitably, the British had to do the same thing at one point in time when they were bringing more ships out further west to where they were. And there's a story that goes that a British ship stopped by the Euclid Creek area, sent some soldiers off onto the land, stole a cow. Back when we were talking about, a celebration, of this community, we wanted to reenact that. I just didn't really. I was going to snitch or borrow the wooden cow that my pastor from St. Mary's has. They forgot to see that he likes cows, so someone had done a wooden cutout for him, anatomically correct. And so we were going to borrow that cow and reenact this, but it just never got to that point. But so people don't, so when after the Battle of Lake Erie, when you again you have all this, and it said that Cleveland was able to hear. One of the other things that I thought was very interesting, it said there was a storm that blew one of the British ships back as they were going out that way, Charlotte, blew it back towards the mouth and to Euclid Creek. So they very easily, our people in this area were not afraid of the British. They were out there standing, you're not going to come up on our land again. Where you had people in the quote-unquote downtown area, in the Cleveland area, at Fort Huntington area and that, who were standing there, who were starting to move this way, further away from the British, because they thought that the Indians and that were coming. They didn't know, of course, who won. They heard the battle. Think about that, folks. There's nothing to block the sound from that battle. And you could hear it at Fort Huntington, which is West 3rd Lakeside. They didn't know who won. Then sometime later, not that day, but some weeks later, they saw ships coming back. They didn't know if it was Perry's ships. They didn't know if it was the British ships. Because when Perry captured the British ships, he captured their ships, brought their ships in tow, and their commander was on his ship with his red coat on. So they didn't know who won and what. They thought, there's a story of someone coming and running. The British are coming. But what was fun here is because those people from West Berkeley area, today's downtown, were moving this way because they were afraid. Where our people here, in these communities, were holding the ground. They weren't going to move. They were going to protect their farmland. And I just thought that was very interesting, and I confirmed these stories with the early settlers folks who talk about Perry. So again, the community was founded. We had, churches. What is the first things that you build when you build a settlement? Your house. What's the second thing you build?
The outhouse.
That's part of your house. What's the next thing that you build, though?
Meeting house.
The bar. The tavern. When Lorenzo Carter built his cabin down in the flats that we used, it had a model of, what was it used for? His home and a meeting place. Of course, who met? Only the guys, right? So what do you do when you meet? Yes. So it is listed as the first meeting house and the first bar and tavern. So literally, when you build a community, you build your homes, then you build your meeting places. Then what comes next? Churches. Your churches. And we're in a you might use your meeting room, your meeting place for a number of different things. But churches are, once now you're settled, now you can spend the time to do church, quote unquote church. You're put in your religion, pray, and because you have time now to do that. So churches started popping up. The first church, and we'll get to your history, but the first church was the First Presbyterian Church. That First Presbyterian Church that sits up at Nilo View and Euclid Avenue was 1805. So it was actually here before Amanda and her family came here. It lasted 201 years as a Presbyterian church. But what's more important is, and I'll probably repeat myself, there's a couple of other slides that show it, there's a cemetery next to it. As old churchyards, old churches did have their churchyards next to their churches. Those were graveyards, not cemeteries. Put their graveyard next to their church, and in that graveyard, Rupels, Jennings, Shaws, McElraths, all your founding members of that area, all the founding Presbyterians and the founders for the Old Stone Church downtown. 1816. 1816, when they came here in January of 1816, what was going on that year? It was the summer, it was the year without a summer. There was a big, huge volcanic eruption the year before that spewed all sorts of contaminants in the air, and across the world that year never saw summer. There were, remember when we had that real cold spell on Mother's Day? Imagine most of your year pretty much like that. That was 1816. You also had, let me see, what else did I put up here? The Cherokee Nation, and I couldn't remember what I put up here. They gave land to the Cherokee Nation, and then a certain person took it away from them and said no, they can't have it, and that's what started the Cherokee Nation and the Trail of Tears. But originally land was ceded to them, and that was 1816, and then they took away that treaty. Charlotte Bronte was born. And in my histories, a woman by the name of Priscilla Cooper Tyler was born. She was the daughter of President John Tyler. She would become first lady for him, basically. His first wife was an invalid, and when he became president in 1840, she couldn't perform her duties. She stayed pretty much upstairs in the White House. Their daughter performed the duties of First Lady until he married his second wife, Julia Gardner Tyler, in 1844, and who was younger than their daughter. Julia was 30 years younger than John Tyler, by the way.
First one.
She died. She would die in 1843. And I can't remember what she died of. She was basically an invalid, and then she just stayed away from people and became more so. But yeah, I mean that's a whole nother talk too. Yeah, I hear so, and I don't know who that is. And I thought I turned it down. I apologize. You cannot see this, but these are the Stones and the siblings for Amanda. We talked about there were 5 of them when they came in here in 1816. There would be 2 more born after that. Now we get into that religious point of view that we started talking about. That Second Great Awakening. When Moses Cleveland and his family was in Connecticut and Massachusetts areas afterward, that was the First Great Awakening. That was the first religious revival type or show of religion in America when they called it the Great Awakening. And that's when you had your Episcopal and your congregational religion and started building churches in those areas. When they started moving westward, then it grew to become a Second Great Awakening. And I found this piece too, which is really funny. You can't see it up in the corner there, a little bit better there. I found the same graphic. But basically what that Great Awakening was, it was revivals. They were meetings, and they would get almost like rallies. We actually, I think, and I don't know the date on it, and I got to find the date on it. We actually had up in an area there by 152nd and Lakeshore Boulevard, there's an area called Beulah Park by the old Walgreens on the other side behind there. We always laugh that there's something in the soil there, not because it was having religion and revivals was bad, it's just that there was a major revival and a camp set up there, and there was some really strange things going on there that we think that may have, we think that there was a lot of drugs.
Spirits.
There was a lot of spirits. There was a lot of spirits, but we think that when I'm reading this, I'm sitting there going, there were some really strange things that were going on with that particular camp. And so we are kind of joking is that there's still those spirits still around.
Beulah's still there, and then there were a number of these kind of camps along the lakeshore. If you take 6 out towards Sandusky, there's a couple of these.
There's still
like
camps
that,
left, yes.
like that.
So basically, bottom line is that by the late 1700s, many in the U.S. no longer regularly attended church. So where you had this movement, but then I don't know if it's because of the war or other things coming in their lives that religion wasn't, they didn't spend as much time worrying about their faith and their spirit, and it kind of sort of died. So they started, what I'm reading, and you can correct me on that they still had their religion, but they didn't go to church. And I think we need a third Great Awakening, because a lot of people are doing that now. Also too, some believe that God did not play an important role in everyday life. God would judge the person on how he or she had lived her life on earth, but other people had become too consumed with earning a living. And that they didn't have time to worship God in a formal setting. As a result, the declining religious convictions, many faiths sponsored, to get the faithful back, they sponsored revivals. These revivals epitomize human beings' dependence upon God. So I mean, it's like, once again, they knew that they were dependent on God, but then real life comes up and trying to survive. And the two, unfortunately, don't mix in their minds. Most of the religious revivals around occurred as camp meetings. Adherents and interested parties would spend several days hearing the Word of God from various religious leaders. Gibbon talked about a number of those leaders, that were around and had done that. And, it's great because you still have those stories. I know one preacher that was up at the First Presbyterian Church. And he was there, he was an abolitionist. He kind of sort of the brother of the most famous of the abolitionists. And he would go on, but he was a preacher there for about 2 years prior to the Civil War. So, you had a lot of, itinerant preachers that would come in and out, and why they came, unless we look really, really deep, and why would they leave? It's because they did their job, and then moved on to the next. So you'd get that. They were also served as social gatherings, because on the frontier, you didn't have regular contact with your neighbors. Your next neighbor, this area was probably a little bit different than that, but you get into some of the larger, more spread out frontier areas, and you were lucky if you saw a neighbor once a year. So this was a way to bring people back into, create a town center, create a meeting house or a church, and you bring somebody in, maybe we can get together and talk over what we need to do maybe once a month, and then spread from there. From what I found, Baptists and Methodists found the largest number of converts, swelling their numbers across the United States that included Ohio. And then you also had new religious groups that would also result from these revivals. And they were unsatisfied with the already established faiths and began to start founding their own. And it's not bad in the way, because we're frontier areas. What's going on here is completely different than what's going on in Boston. What's going on here is completely different than what's going on in Canterbury. Even though Canterbury to this day probably has more cemeteries than it does people who live in the town. Okay? But there's still a lot of different things going on there than what's going on out here. The revivals encourage people to return to God. Many people in the U.S. were convinced to more actively dedicate their lives to God and to live in a godly manner. And as a result, church attendance did increase. A desire to reform the U.S. also rose out of this Second Great Awakening. And what I thought was interesting, because I never kind of sort of put two and two together with this point, with the Great Awakening part, but temperance and abolitionism both come out of this movement, because now you put a more emphasis on your body and what was going on. You know, slavery was not something that was morally right. Once you start thinking about, your own soul, then you start looking outward. So you have a lot of that different movement. Also, too, women's involvement in the revivals provided support for women's rights and the women's rights movements. So you already start to get, all of these different things. And I always tell people when I teach Civil War history, look at what women did during the time of the Civil War. It didn't just start in 1860. It started prior to it and was pushed forward. And that's why I absolutely love, Mary Poppins, because it's so much about, women's rights and the right to vote and suffrage in England at that time. Yes. And you have that same thing going on prior to that in America. It just took us so much longer to get that. Again, your formal churches. By 1807, we have, Church of Christ in Euclid, that's, formed to what's today East Cleveland, the First Presbyterian Church of East Cleveland, and after they sold it, it becomes New Life Cathedral. What's really interesting about the New Life Cathedral, it's still the same pastor, Pastor Braxton over there, and, one of these days I really still need to go back and reconnect with him, but his mother, he doesn't live in the community, but his mother lives in the North Shore Colorado area. She calls us all the time. And it was weird making that connection. So he's really, became a pastor in a church, in a community he grew up in. But they're the caretakers of that graveyard, whether they want to be or not. They too have a bell pull. I don't know if it works, but they too have a bell tower. And the bell, last time I was in there, I don't know if it worked or not, I don't remember, but it was still there. Yeah, I know, exactly. In 1820, we had the Euclid Baptist Church formed, then became a Disciples Church. And this gentleman here, actually then was an original disciple for the Disciples Church, and then went on with John Smith and the Latter-day Saints. So you had all this going on before 1830. And the Catholics came in very late, and I was going to tell you that. The Catholics came in very late. I don't have a slide for it, but as I'm talking all this, I'm like, yeah, the Catholics came in very late. St. Paul's, and if you ever hear us talk, we'll say Euclid City Cemetery. And the reason why we say that is because a lot of times when I say Euclid Cemetery, people think of St. Paul's. It was a Catholic cemetery, always was a Catholic graveyard because it was next to the church. And today it's a part of the Catholic Cemeteries Association. Not that they really took care of it, but the reason why we say that is because a lot of people still call, well, for whatever reason, call it Euclid Cemetery. It's St. Paul's Cemetery. Even though, as I said, it's technically a graveyard because it was next to the church. St. Paul's, even though the church that we see today, there was a major rebuild in the Catholic churches in this community in the 1950s. So every Catholic church building you see in our Colwyn and Nottingham area started much earlier than that, but the buildings are all from the 1950s. But St. Paul's was the first Catholic church that came into the community, and it's 1858, so just prior to the Civil War. You will find the first pastor who is buried in that grave. You'll find you'll find school choir children over there, and you will find a couple of other pastors, priests from the community who were, not necessarily just from St. Paul's, but also then St. Mary's was founded in 1906. But there's an earlier church even further east than that, St. Aloysius. So, which predates St. Mary's, because St. Mary's came out of that church. But and then through that area, but and St. Joseph's Church on 148 in St. Clair area actually predates St. Mary's because St. Mary's came out of St. Joseph's area too. So, and then you have St. Jerome's that was after that, and then you have the Lithuanian Church. So this area too, and I don't put it as a part of this. I put it as part of my Collinwood talk, but the immigration into this area. You guys told me that your founders were Welsh. We have, and we have others, we have the Scottish connection. We have the German, Slovenian, Irish, Italians, all moved into these areas. Why? That thing called the railroad.
Yes.
Amen. That railroad brought in a lot of immigrants and a lot of different nationalities. And what happened in our community was reflected in a bigger part of Cleveland, but you see it in smaller pockets of neighborhoods where you find the Irish were here. The African Americans were also on the railroad area. You had the pocket of the Slovenians, and then you had the Italians. And each and every one of those groups was seen as an outcast.
Yes.
That's why they come in and form they form their little communities because of that. Back to Amanda, she and her family and her siblings became very active in the Methodist Church that was being formed in these early years. You talked about the camp meeting of 1820-21. Held up on Euclid Ridge. They were there. As a matter of fact, her mother was one of the first 3 members of the church. So her family was not only a founding member of the church, but very active and remained active to their deaths. Following that camp meeting, and you had mentioned some of these folks here, and what I'm trying to do is I found that book, that Pioneer book. I just have to download it or send for it. You can have it printed on demand. You can download it, but you can't print it. So, and I want a printing of it. I think I have parts of it, but not all of it. And you had mentioned, about Dennis Cooper before. And the church that was built, that had been built at Green and Euclid Avenue. And what I'd like to do, with your permission, is get your PowerPoint and put it as a part of this, because that way we can use that, and then you can take some of my stuff and incorporate it in too, so that we can have you know, a lot more, as we always take a talk and always expand it. I never do the same talk twice. Again, Samuel Gregg, who documented these names in the history of Methodism at their conference, and each member without the wives' names. Why is that? Because a wife was secondary. When I teach Civil War history from the Soldiers and Sailors Monument, we have a women's panelist walking the monument. And if you look at the women's names, you'll see Miss Mary, Mrs. Joseph, or Mrs. So-and-so. When a woman got married, she gave up her identity to the public. So she was no longer known by her given name in public. Amongst her friends, you could call her that, if amongst a group of women. But if it was in public, of mixed company, she would then always become Mrs. Daly or Mrs. Timothy Daly. Never, you know, by my first name. And if they weren't married, then they have there's no other way to name them and call them, but you would call them by their, you know, their given name, their birth name. But you gave up a lot of your own identity. Women didn't own their own property. They weren't their own person. And so it's like, it's very interesting, you know, like it doesn't surprise me that some of the wives' names are not mentioned by name, other than the wife of.
And how many of you were old enough to remember when that still was being held?
Oh yeah, absolutely. No, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, it's, growing up, it was never, I would never call Elder. It was always Mrs. Bryan. What's interesting is my nephew will not call my mom Jenny. My nephew will only call my mom Mrs. Jessic. How's
That's
Mrs.
what I
Jessic
do.
doing?
That's what I grew
And
up.
that's just because of the way he was brought up.
That's the way I was brought up. I went to a friend's house, I would know
Oh.
if I knew her first name.
Oh, yeah.
Because I would no more think of addressing my friend's mother by her
Exactly.
given name than, you know.
Again, the book is called the Pioneer, I think it's the memoirs, actually, of the Pioneer Women of Western Reserve. And it says, I think I found, she wrote this book and I think two history books as well. So I'm gonna try downloading them, and if I ever get them downloaded where I can, or get a copy of them. I have some stuff, I have some histories, but I don't remember seeing this one. Or I've only seen pieces, parts, where I was only specifically looking like a Rupel family. Because I was doing a lot of Rupel family history for a while, I still am. Again, her mother was one of the original members of the church, and she followed, Amanda followed in her footsteps. And it is noted in this book that I was a charter member of the ME Church in Euclid, Methodist Episcopal Church in Euclid, which was at one time the largest church in the county. Her brother Paul was also an active member in the church, and he began, it says, and I think you sent me this information, that he began an apprenticeship with Curtis Gould in a woolen mill, which is the mill that's right on the corner there, this way. I'm like pointing too far that way, you know, and as I said, that's a piece of history that we really need to get documented as well, you know, because it's really hard to get some of that history.
It would have been previously William Coleman's mill, too.
Right, and you know, and then because I also have one of my little asides, the Marsilliot family.
Mhm.
They were making pottery jars, and I don't know how big they were. Now, it could have been this big, it could have been this big. I don't know what the size was. I have a picture of one, and I'm trying to get somebody to see if they can do sizing on it, just from the picture that we have. We have a pottery place up on Waterloo Road that I was trying to get interested in, trying to do a miniature of that jar, because it reminds me very much of the Greek jars, amphora jars, because it kind of sort of comes like this, and it was, you know, used in the shipping industry for oil water, and whatever.
I
You
think
know.
that's in Dave's book too, that he invited.
Yes, yes, exactly, you know, so that's where I love, it's like, so I'm trying to get a scale on that to see just, if somebody can either draw it for me or make it for me, so that we have an idea of what it actually looked size-wise, But, as I said, he, had worked in that woolen mill, and then he goes off to Bath Township area and, and the church in Montrose. So, he goes off. Well, Amanda finally gets married in 1830, and she marries a Walter Frizzell. Guess who married her? Dennis Cooper. They have 8 children, and these are their 8 children. The one that struck me, as I said, is Henry Mortimer Frizzell. Now, he is a twin, he has a twin sister, but I'll come back to him in a minute. And these are, again, Find a Grave is wonderful when it works, when somebody has done the right research on Find a Grave, because the codicil to that is people who have done a lot of work on Find a Grave, and I have yet had the time to correct all of them, screwed up. Big time on my column of school fire children. Thank you for the photos, folks, but if you're going to put in their story, don't put the same story to each one of them, because then people think it only belongs to that child instead of looking at it as a general gist of the story. But in some cases, they've got the wrong families, because there are multiple families, and they've got several times that I've found that they've got the wrong child with the wrong family. But these again are their children. Henry, when I saw this, I was like, oh, cool. Why didn't I ever think of this? Why didn't I ever remember seeing this guy's name on the wall? I've done a lot of research within the Supposed Soldiers and Sailors Monument. The Ruppel family, as I said, though Sam Ruppel was a part of the 1st Ohio Light Artillery and died at Stones River in January of 1863. Charles Dilley dies in Andersonville as a part of the 23rd Ohio, and Hayes's unit, Rutherford B. Hayes, that night also almost got captured that night too. They got him away, and some of the other guys were not so lucky. Matter of fact, we had 39 gentlemen who served from the Cleveland area, Cuyahoga County area, who ended up at Andersonville and died. I don't know how many in total, but we know the 39 ended there and died. What's really cool, and I'll get back to Henry in a second, is when we went down to Andersonville a few years ago, when that major hurricane was coming up from Florida and scared everybody and pushed us out. We says, you know what, this is the closest we're ever probably going to get to Andersonville. We need to go. So we went the day before they were starting to shove everybody north. When we were in Georgia at the time, never again will I ever drive through Atlanta. But I'll always remember this trip. But what's really cool is because we have the names, and you go in, and he gave us all the numbers, because all the graves are numbered in Andersonville, thanks to Clara Barton. We went in, and it's nothing like standing there. There's a tree. Charles Dilley's grave is there. And you can stand there and go, Charles Hollywood is here. It was the coolest thing for my husband and I to be able to do, to actually see him after walking through Andersonville. Henry, on the other hand, serves as a member of the 103rd Ohio Volunteer Infantry. The 103rd is under Levi Schofield. Levi Schofield is the captain in the 103rd Ohio Volunteer Infantry, and if you go downtown to the monument, that front unit on the monument is the 103rd at Coxsackie, Georgia. It's not a glorious piece of battle scene. Everyone is either injured or killed in that grouping. They had lost the flag 6 times that night. Also, two members from 7th Ohio were also killed that night up on that mountain. But he serves as a part of the 103rd Ohio Volunteer Infantry. He's mustered in and for a 3-year term, and is appointed as corporal in 1864, and is mustered out in May of 1865. So, a month after, a little more than a month after the quote-unquote beginning of the end of the war at Appomattox. What's really funny is because I never knew where Beaufort, Beaufort, South Carolina was until my vacation this year. It's down near Paris Island. We actually got down into low country this year, south of Charleston. Ladies Island, Johns Island, Paris Island, Beaufort, or Beaufort actually, is down in that area. And that's where these guys mustered out of. And it's Ed Wagner's batteries down that way. He's believed to have been at Resaca, Georgia, so he survived that same night at Resaca where we lost people, and survived that attack. He is on the monument. I forgot to put that photo up here with it, but I do have his photo of his name etched on the wall in that panel. And the 103rd, as I said, was instrumental in the monument and its history. So and he was also an active member of the Grand Army of the Republic, and our unit, our chapter that was here that these guys were a part of, was the John Brown, or John Bro, or however you want to pronounce it, camp. And he was a governor of the state of Ohio who was actually buried at Woodland Cemetery. And then this is his wife. We were talking about the railroad. I'm going to go through the rest of these very quickly. Again, the railroad, Frogsville, column was called Frogsville. And I don't know where that line was. We can't find if that meant this entire area that included Nottingham as well, or if that was just for a specific area in that column area piece. We use this particular train. I don't know if you can see it. It's an 1860s train. Her husband passes away in 1883 and is buried up in Euclid City Cemetery. And then Amanda will pass away in November of 1888. They remained active, as did many of their children and grandchildren. And we know that because we have people who are still part of your church. That's right. And, but as I said, Amanda, I really would like to know more about her personally. I can put her into perspective, as I said, and with the rest of the people around her, like her son and stuff like that. But, she lived through that. Imagine, living through that. The Whipple family lived through that. The Dillies to live through that. And that's why when we put the Veterans Stone in at Veterans Park, why we said that it honors all those who served from the time of our founding in 1796 to today. Because we were thinking of all of those from, who had served in the American Revolution before coming here, and then served in the War of 1812 and Civil War, and then every other war after that. One of the other things that, you had talked about this, bringing it up to today's, and your Uncle Jimmy. And I just put that on the slide so that I can learn more about that. And again, her family had seen the church buildings move, and but her husband Walter didn't. She did. Actually she didn't either because she died in 1888. So it's by 1892 they did not see the church built at that point in time. But they had been involved up into that point in time. So I'm sure that they were instrumental in, still giving opinions as to what should be done.
Still giving opinions, yes.
And again, You know, these are just some of the pictures. This is again an up close, if you can see it a little bit better here, of the Frizzell stone. And some of the other ones. Is that you who put the flag there, or was it?
No,
there?
no, the flags are there because they're revolutionary.
From Memorial
Yeah.
Day, probably.
Yeah. There's quite a few of them up there.
It was kind of interesting that when we went to Atlanta, out to Savannah on this last vacation, we went to one of the cemeteries, and we found a marker that I had never seen before. I know about it, but I never saw a marker for Mayflower descendant. You know, but then again, when you go into a cemetery that's that old, you know, you're bound to find some different markers. I knew about, you know, I know about the descendants of the Mayflower, but I've never seen a marker on a grave of one. You know, so it was kind of neat. And these are this is stuff out of Find a Grave. So when you look at Find a Grave, this is the basic information you will find. You know, where they're born, death, and this is also when you start doing ancestry stuff. You'll find this is the kind of stuff that you want to have these. If you're going to then go into it, you need to have this basic information, because, like in my family, there's too many Jenny and Louis, and none of them have middle names. So if you don't know their birth and death dates, you're gonna put the wrong Jenny with the wrong Louis, and I've done that.
Yeah.
And these are just, you know, this is Walter and things. So, I mean, this is just about us. But I've done it. My mom laughs, and I says, Mom, you did the same thing. You married a Lou. Your mom was Jenny. My mom's name is Jenny. My grandmother was not real creative with names. Her name is Jenny. She named her oldest daughter Jenny. I'll get back to the other sister in a minute. The one brother was Joseph. My grandfather's name was Joseph. The youngest brother was David, because my grandmother liked the name, the woman calling David from down the street. David was born later. My Uncle Dave was born 19 years later than my mom was 19 and getting married, carrying her baby brother. Okay, so you can picture this. But, so he's 19 years younger than her, but my grandmother liked the name of the woman calling her son from down the street, David! So that's what she named it. I still swear to this day that the other sister's name was Elsie. She got it from Elsie Borden, from Borden's Mill. And I don't have a problem with that, because I like Elsie the cow, and I actually collect Elsie the cow. So, but my grandmother was not. But I told my mom, I said, I'm surprised she didn't name a Lou. Because, and then she had other uncles. There was a Lou and a Jenny in the family, and they each married. Jenny married a Lou, Lou married a Jenny. What did they name their kids? And each one of them, Lou and Jenny. My mom, Jenny, marries Lou. That's why I'm married Louise. But it's, you know, so if you don't look and check the dates of people, you can, and as I said, I've done it with my dad's family.
And encourage your kids to be more creative.
Right, and just as an aside, I have a Rupel family. My husband's connected into the Rupel family, kind of distantly. It's an aunt, a great aunt, that got married and then divorced. So actually, their sibling is direct. My husband's indirect. But I have my family, there's two brothers, my grandmother's two brothers, who married, each of them got married, and the girls' last names are the same. So either somebody screwed up with the last names and gave them each the same, maiden name, because each of them goes back to different fathers. I can't connect them. But one of them is a Rupel. I have another Rupel sitting out here, a Marie, that married a gentleman with that same last name. And I can't connect these three of them. So I have three branches of a family that I can't connect.
Oh, gosh.
So, I'm dying because I told my husband, I says, you know, it's really be freaky if I ever connect this family, so that your family and my family are connected.
Don't try too hard.
Yeah.
We did it with another family for our son's Union Veterans Group. And the one guy goes, he says, oh God, we're interrelated into that same Sam's and his brother Abner's family. They're from the west side and they're interrelated into this family that's called Guest Workers. And they're all from the North Olmsted area. Because after Sam died, his family moved to North Olmsted. And they're buried up in Butternut Ridge. They founded a farm out in that area it used to be called it's called Beach Street. It should be called Google Road. It goes right into NASA. If you follow it from North Olmsted and follow it in, it's a park road that goes to NASA. It's the same family. Wow. So one of these days I'll try, you know, there's got to be other connections beyond, you know, and it's like, you know, that's when you take your family's connections here with the Crozier and Frizzell families. And I bet, you know, you start expanding out and you'll find connections that you never knew. And like you said, it's a small world, especially in that time period. Because like I said, brothers and sisters were marrying brothers and sisters. You know, because of the small, who else are you going to marry? But the farmer's daughter down the street. You know, but again, thank you so much. If there's any information that I can add to this talk, just let me know.
Well, the railroad brought my mom's grandfather here, and they're his sons, and they all worked at the Midwest Forge.
Yes.
The whole.
I was going to say Midwest Forge. It was either Midwest Forge or Fisher Body or the railroad.
Yeah.
Those were the three at Eaton Axle. My grandfather was a coal miner in Kansas, and when the coal mine closed in the early 40s, my mom's the only person that I know that ever ran away from home and then brought her parents to follow her. But the coal mine died, the coal mine closed, and she sent money back home to bring her father to Cleveland because Eaton Axle was hiring.
Yeah, that's what brought them up to the coal miners.
Exactly. You know, so I mean, it's strange connected. You know, because I'll be doing, that's one of the talks, Pastor Debbie, that I'm going to be doing together for next year. Is the one on my mom about the coal mining in Southeast Kansas. We have a cousin who is instrumental in putting their music together. After a tornado ripped town apart, they were able to get funding to rebuild their community center, turn it into a community center / town museum. So my mom's picture, her family is in that museum because of
You're going back there to do that?
I don't know. It's been an excuse to get back out there. I've been out there since I was 14. It's just there was just no reason to go back out there, and my mom didn't want to go, and I was going to go with her. And now she's at a point where she'll go out of the house, let alone travel. But my husband and I had it planned to go out there last year. You know, we had planned in 19 to go out last year. We were going to go to Branson. Branson's only an hour and a half away from Franklin, Kansas, which is near Joplin, Missouri. And so we just did. But again, thank you so much. Thank you. Something that I love
Just wanted to remind everybody that next Saturday we'll be at the mouth of the creek. That's the Wildwood, yeah. And if it's a yucky day there are a couple picnic shelters. So I'm expecting Roy will continue there rather than come inside.
Okay.
So
we will have Roy
Roy Larrick will be our speaker.
And Saturday at 6
Yes,
they're going to
yes.
talk about the mouth of the
Well, that's what's
the
interesting.
river,
Because we're going to
the
be
creek and all that
at
whole area. Yeah.
42, I think.
He's gonna talk about the land and the water and the lake, the creek and the lake and the land, and how that impacted what happened in this neighborhood. And then the importance today of being good stewards in green spaces and some of that stuff, which we're actually pursuing.
Working to try to get
Yeah,
that
to
green
try to be
space
part of
going.
here, so. So yeah, so thanks for coming out, and if y'all have any questions